My place card at my wife's company gala read, "Idiot Trash." She saw it, her boss saw it, and the two of them laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes with the cocktail napkin. I didn't say a word. I stood up, straightened my jacket, found the president of the company across the ballroom, and whispered exactly 2 sentences in his ear. Then I walked out into the Seattle rain and drove home alone. The next morning at 9 a.m., an all-staff email went out to 1,100 employees. Subject line: Company ownership transition, effective immediately. Every position in that department terminated by lunch. My name is Sterling Vance. I'm 48 years old, and up until that Friday night in October, my wife believed I was just a quiet man with a boring consulting job who paid half the mortgage and stayed out of her way. She had no idea I owned 61% of the company she worked for. She had no idea because I made absolutely sure she never would. I live in Laurelhurst, a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood on the shore of Lake Washington in Seattle, the kind of place where the houses are old money and the lawns are cut every Tuesday, whether they need it or not. I drive a 2019 Honda Accord. I wear the same 3 Navy sport coats on rotation. I've eaten lunch at the same deli on 24th Avenue for 9 years, and the woman behind the counter, Donna, knows my order before I open my mouth. Turkey on rye, no mustard. Nobody who met me at that deli would ever guess that 14 years ago, I sold a logistics software company for $340 million and quietly rolled a chunk of that money into a private holding company that, among other things, owns the controlling stake in Bellwether Meridian Group, a mid-size marketing and events firm headquartered in a glass building in downtown Seattle. My wife Claudine has worked there for 6 years. She has never once suspected that the silent majority shareholder she complained about over dinner, some ghost investor nobody's ever met, she called him, was sitting across the table eating his turkey sandwich and nodding along like he had no idea what she meant. I want to tell you how we got here, because the place card wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment the whole rotten structure finally cracked open where I could see it clean. I met Claudine 11 years ago at a friend's barbecue in Wallingford. She was 34 then, sharp-featured, quick-tongued, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and immediately locate the person worth talking to. She worked in event marketing, and she had this way of describing her job that made it sound like she was single-handedly keeping the entire hospitality industry of the Pacific Northwest afloat. I liked that about her. I liked her confidence, the way she never apologized for taking up space. We dated for a year and a half, married in a small ceremony at the Chihuly Garden and Glass, just 40 guests, and settled into the house in Laurelhurst that I'd already owned outright since the sale of my company. From the outside, we looked like an easy match. From the inside, something had been curdling for years, and I'd been too stubborn, or too proud, or maybe just too patient to call it what it was. Claudine's boss is a man named Preston Kilgore, Senior Vice President of Client Relations at Bellwether Meridian. Preston is 44, silver at the temples in that deliberately maintained way, drives a Tesla he mentions in almost every conversation, and has the particular talent of making everyone in a room feel like they're one witty remark away from being his best friend, right up until you're not useful to him anymore. I'd met Preston exactly twice before that October night, both times at low-key company mixers I'd attended specifically because Claudine begged me to make an appearance. And both times he'd shaken my hand, called me champ, and immediately forgotten I existed. Preston did not know who signed off on his budget every quarter. Preston did not know whose signature was on the lease for the glass building he strutted through like he owned it. Preston knew exactly one thing about me, that I was Claudine's husband, the quiet one, the one who did something in consulting, and that I was, by every measure that mattered to him, beneath his notice. That should have been my first warning about how deep the rot went in that office. But the real warning came 18 months earlier, on a Tuesday morning in April, when a decision I'd made as an anonymous shareholder rippled down through the company and landed, without me intending it, directly on Claudine's desk. Let me back up further, because you need to understand exactly how I built the wall between Sterling the husband and Sterling the majority owner, because that wall is the whole reason this story is possible. After I sold my software company, Meridian Systems, back in 2011, I didn't want the life that comes with obvious wealth. I'd watched 2 of my old business partners implode after their exits. One got divorced inside of 14 months once his ex-wife realized what he was worth. The other got swarmed by cousins and old college roommates asking for just a small loan. I decided early that I would build my next chapter through a private holding company, Vance Meridian Capital, registered in Delaware, run through a small, tight-lipped team, and I would never, under any circumstances, let my name appear anywhere near the businesses I invested in. I bought stakes in 6 companies over the following decade: a regional bank, 2 logistics firms, a specialty pharmacy chain, a boutique hotel group, and, in 2017, an 61% controlling position in Bellwether Meridian Group, which at the time was a struggling 12-person events shop I saw real potential in. I met Claudine in 2013, 2 years after I'd already begun building Vance Meridian Capital, and by the time we married in 2014, the wall was already up. When she talked about her work, I asked normal husband questions. How was your day? Is that client still difficult? Did you get the Henderson account? I never once let on that I had, 3 years earlier, personally approved the acquisition that folded her tiny firm into what would eventually become Bellwether Meridian Group. She joined the renamed, expanded company in 2018, thinking she'd simply landed a good job at a growing firm. She had no idea she was walking into a building I owned. For 6 years, I sat across from her at dinner and listened to her talk about corporate, like it was a distant, faceless weather system that occasionally rained problems down on her department. Corporate wants us to cut the Q3 budget. Corporate is being cheap about the holiday party again. Corporate doesn't understand what we actually do down here. I nodded. I asked follow-up questions, and every single time I already knew exactly what corporate wanted, because I was the one who'd approved it that morning from my home office 2 floors above her head while she got ready for work. It should have felt like a betrayal, keeping that from her. For years, honestly, it felt more like a mercy. I told myself I was protecting the marriage from the complications that come with a spouse who has real institutional power over your career. I told myself she'd feel undermined, watched, second-guessed at every promotion, every raise, every conflict with a coworker, if she knew her husband was the man behind the curtain. I told myself a lot of things. Some of them were even true. But somewhere around year 4, the marriage started shifting in a way I couldn't explain with theories about privacy and protection. Claudine started coming home later. She started taking calls in the bathroom with the fan running. She stopped asking about my day at all, not out of hostility, just a kind of quiet erosion, the way a habit disappears once nobody's tending it anymore. And she started talking about Preston Kilgore differently. Not as her boss, as her person. Preston thinks. Preston said. Preston's the only one at that place who actually gets it. I noticed. I always notice. It's the thing that made me good at building companies, and it's the thing that made those years harder than they needed to be. Because I saw the shape of what was happening long before I had proof of it, and I made a decision early on that I would not confront shadows. I would wait for something solid. The April incident was the first solid thing. 18 months before the gala, Bellwether Meridian's board, which is to say my board, populated by people I trust and one rotating outside member for optics, was reviewing department performance ahead of the fiscal year. Claudine's team, the client engagement group, had put together a proposal for an expanded events budget, nearly $400,000, to run a series of high-profile launch parties for a new hospitality client. I read every line of that proposal, the way I read every proposal that crosses my desk, carefully, skeptically, with the numbers laid out beside 3 years of comparable data. It was bloated. Nearly $90,000 of it was allocated to a brand experience consultant, who turned out, on closer inspection, to be a company owned by Preston Kilgore's college roommate, an arrangement that had never been disclosed to procurement. I killed it. Not maliciously. I sent it back through the CFO with a note asking for the conflict of interest to be resolved and the budget resubmitted at a more defensible number. Standard governance. The kind of thing a majority shareholder does 11 times a year without anyone downstream ever knowing his name. What I did not expect was that Preston Kilgore, rather than absorb the correction like an adult, would spend the following 2 weeks in the office loudly blaming some ghost investor upstairs who doesn't understand how relationships work in this industry, and that Claudine, my own wife, would come home and repeat that exact phrase to me at the dinner table, almost verbatim, with a kind of contempt in her voice I hadn't heard directed at me in years. Preston says corporate killed our whole launch plan over some technicality. Some faceless guy who's never run an event in his life decided he knew better. She rolled her eyes. She actually rolled her eyes at the idea of me, without knowing it was me, and I sat there with a forkful of salmon halfway to my mouth, and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. I want to be honest with you about that moment, because it's the one I keep coming back to. It wasn't rage. Rage is loud and it burns itself out. What I felt was quieter than that, and much more durable. It was the specific settling recognition that my wife had chosen a side without knowing there were sides to choose, and that the side she'd chosen was the one working actively against the thing I'd spent a decade building. I didn't say anything that night. I asked her to pass the asparagus. But I started paying attention in a different way after that. Over the following months, I watched the pattern solidify. Claudine's late nights clustered suspiciously around Thursdays, the day Preston's calendar, which, yes, as majority owner I technically had visibility into through our shared administrative systems, though I'd never once looked before that April, showed blocked-off time labeled simply strategy session. I watched her buy a new perfume, something warmer and muskier than the light citrus she'd worn for years. I watched her engagement with our marriage thin out to the structural minimum. Shared calendar logistics, grocery lists, the occasional obligatory Sunday dinner with her parents in Kirkland. I did not hire anyone to follow her. I did not need to. I had 6 years of receipts already sitting in the company's own expense and calendar systems, because Preston Kilgore was sloppy in the particular way that men get sloppy when they've never once in their life faced a consequence for anything. I found the corporate card statements. 2 dinners a month, sometimes 3, at restaurants that were nowhere near any client Preston's team actually serviced. Canless up on Aurora, a place that runs $400 a couple without wine, and a small, quiet Italian place in Madison Park that I happened to know, because I'd taken Claudine there myself on our 5th anniversary for its private back room. I found a hotel charge from July, one night at the Fairmont downtown, filed under Client Entertainment, Northgate account, except Bellwether Meridian had no active Northgate account that year. I did not go looking for this because I was suspicious in some paranoid, obsessive way. I went looking because I am, by training and by nature, a man who reconciles numbers, and numbers that don't reconcile bother me at a level deeper than emotion. The numbers didn't reconcile. Neither did my marriage. I want to tell you I confronted her the day I found the Fairmont charge. I didn't. I sat with it for 3 weeks, turning it over, testing it against every innocent explanation I could construct, because I have built my entire adult life around the discipline of not moving until I'm certain, and some old-fashioned, foolish part of me kept hoping I'd find the explanation that made this all a misunderstanding. I never found it. What I found instead, going back through 18 months of records with the patience of a man who used to build financial models for a living, was a pattern so consistent it could have been charted on a graph. Claudine and Preston Kilgore had been having an affair for at least a year and a half, conducted almost entirely on the company's own money, filed under expense codes so lazy a first-year auditor would have caught them, in a company I happened to own 61% of. There's a particular kind of humiliation in that specific detail that I don't think most people would understand unless they'd lived it. It wasn't just that my wife was unfaithful. It's that she was unfaithful using my money, laundered through expense reports I could have flagged with one email, in a building whose lease I'd personally guaranteed, under the nose of a man, me, who everyone in that building had been trained, by years of my own careful invisibility, to consider irrelevant. I made a decision in September, 5 weeks before the gala, sitting alone in my home office at 11 at night with the Fairmont statement glowing on my second monitor. I was not going to confront Claudine across the kitchen table. I was not going to hire a lawyer and quietly serve papers. I was not, frankly, even going to fire Preston Kilgore in some boring procedural HR meeting that he'd spin into a story about a jealous, overbearing ghost investor with no evidence and no spine. I was going to let this play out exactly the way people like Preston Kilgore, and apparently my wife assumed the world worked, where confidence and charm and a good table at the annual gala meant you were untouchable. And then I was going to end it in a way so complete and so public that neither of them would ever again make the mistake of underestimating a quiet man in a Navy sport coat. The Bellwether Meridian Fall Gala is the company's marquee event, held every October at the Fairmont Olympic downtown, The same hotel, incidentally, where Preston had filed his fraudulent Northgate charge. 600 employees, clients, and vendors, a plated dinner, an open bar that runs until midnight, and a stage where the outgoing president, a decent tired man named Harold Whitfield, who'd been running day-to-day operations since I acquired the company, and who reported to me quarterly through channels Claudine had never once asked about, gave a speech about the year's growth. I had never attended in 6 years. I always had a reason. A business trip, a headache, a scheduling conflict I invented on the spot. Claudine had long since stopped asking me to come. This year, in early October, I told her I wanted to. "I want to see where you spend all your time," I said, and she looked at me for a second like she was recalibrating something, and then smiled the two bright smiles she'd started using on me sometime in the last year, and said, "Of course, honey, I'd love that." I spent those 5 weeks doing two things in parallel. In public, I was the attentive husband, asking about seating charts and what I should wear, letting Claudine believe this was a sweet, overdue gesture from a man finally taking interest in her career. In private, I was on the phone with Harold Whitfield twice a week, laying the groundwork for something Harold didn't fully understand yet, but trusted me enough to execute without asking too many questions, because in 6 years, I'd never once steered him wrong. I also, in that same window, quietly initiated the process of selling Bellwether Meridian Group. I need to be precise about this part, because it's the part people find hardest to believe. I didn't invent a sale to punish my wife. I had been fielding a serious acquisition offer for over a year from a much larger national events and hospitality conglomerate, Ashford Bell Partners, out of Chicago, who wanted Bellwether Meridian's Pacific Northwest client roster and were prepared to pay a premium that made the deal, on pure financial terms, one I would have taken regardless of what was happening in my marriage. What the affair did was give me a reason to stop dragging my feet on the timeline. I had been slow-walking the negotiation for months, unsure whether I wanted to disrupt 1,100 people's jobs over a deal that was good but not urgent. Once I understood exactly what kind of culture had been allowed to metastasize under Preston Kilgore's unsupervised leadership, the expense fraud, the affair, the casual, rotten little kingdom he'd built for himself 2 floors below my wife's actual desk, the deal stopped being a maybe. Ashford Bell had one non-negotiable condition in their acquisition terms, one they'd actually proposed themselves before I ever said a word about my personal situation: a full restructuring of the client engagement division, the division Preston ran, with all current positions eliminated and replaced by Ashford Bell's own team within 90 days of close. That condition existed on paper before October ever happened. October just told me exactly when to sign it. I finalized the term sheet with Ashford Bell on a Wednesday in mid-October. Closing was set, contractually, contingent only on my signature and Harold's operational sign-off, for the Monday after the gala. Harold knew the sale was coming. He did not know the personal reasons I'd chosen that particular weekend to execute it. I told him only what he needed, that I wanted the announcement to go out first thing Monday morning, company-wide, no advance warning to any department head, including Preston Kilgore. Harold, bless him, is the kind of operator who doesn't ask a majority owner why. He just asks what time. The night of the gala arrived cold and clear, one of those rare dry October evenings Seattle gives you right before the rain settles in for 6 months. Claudine wore a deep emerald dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, and I remember thinking, driving downtown with her in the passenger seat checking her lipstick in the visor mirror, that she looked genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time, and some old, tired part of me still wanted, even then, for there to be an innocent explanation waiting for me somewhere in that ballroom. There wasn't. The Fairmont's grand ballroom was lit gold, round tables of 10 scattered across the floor, a jazz trio working through standards near the bar. I checked our table assignment against the easel by the entrance, table 14, and Claudine drifted off almost immediately toward a cluster of co-workers near the champagne, the easy, practiced motion of someone returning to her natural habitat. I made my way to table 14 alone, found my seat by the small calligraphed card at each place setting, and picked mine up to check the spelling of my own name, an old habit from a lifetime of business dinners where nobody ever gets it right. It read, "Idiot Trash." I want to describe exactly what that felt like because I think people imagine a moment like that as instant fury, and it wasn't. It was almost clinical. I turned the card over once, checked the back, as if there might be an explanation printed there. There wasn't. I set it back down exactly where it had been, and I looked up. And that's when I saw Claudine, 20 feet away, laughing with her hand pressed flat against Preston Kilgore's forearm, both of them glancing toward table 14 with the specific, unmistakable body language of people watching their joke land. Preston said something else. Claudine's head tipped back. She actually had to dab beneath her eye with the corner of a cocktail napkin. She was laughing so hard. Later I would learn, through Harold, through the head of catering who I called personally the following week, exactly how it happened. The seating chart had been assembled by an events coordinator on Preston's team, a young woman named Bailey who did whatever Preston told her to do without asking questions, the same way everyone on that floor had learned to operate. Preston had told her, as a joke, days before the event, to swap out the calligraphed card at whatever seat belonged to Claudine's husband, the boring one. Bailey, 24 years old and not remotely equipped to say no to a senior vice president, printed it exactly as instructed. Preston's plan, as far as I can tell, wasn't even that sophisticated. It was pure cruelty for its own sake, the kind of casual, confident cruelty men like Preston deploy when they've never once been made to feel small, because he had spent 6 years absorbing the idea, largely from Claudine herself, that Sterling Vance was nobody worth being careful around. I sat down at table 14. I did not flip the card over dramatically or storm across the ballroom. I picked up my water glass, took a slow drink, and I watched my wife laugh at a joke made at my expense, orchestrated by the man she was sleeping with, in a building I owned, at a company I controlled, funded in part by expense fraud I'd already documented in a folder on my own hard drive. And somewhere in that stretch of maybe 90 seconds, the last soft, hopeful part of me that had spent 5 weeks quietly hoping for an innocent explanation finished closing itself off, cleanly, permanently, like a door settling into its frame. I stood up, I straightened my jacket, and I walked across that ballroom toward the small cluster of people near the stage, where Harold Whitfield was checking his notes for his speech, and beside him, sipping a club soda and looking politely bored, was the actual president of Ashford Bell Partners, a man named Desmond Ruiz, who had flown in from Chicago that morning specifically because I'd asked him to attend, quietly, as my guest, ahead of Monday's closing. I leaned in close to Desmond, not Harold, because Desmond was the man whose signature would make this real within 48 hours, and I said 2 sentences. I've told very few people exactly what those 2 sentences were, but I'll tell you now, because you've earned it by sitting through the rest of this story. I said, "The client engagement division has a serious, documented conflict of interest and fraud problem under its current leadership. I want it gone in the first restructuring wave, effective the moment we close." Desmond, who had already reviewed the general shape of the acquisition terms, and simply hadn't known which department I meant when I'd flagged cultural issues during our earlier calls, nodded once, the small economical nod of a man who deals in decisions, not discussions. "Understood," he said. "That's your call to make." I did not go back to table 14. I found Claudine's coat in the check room myself, told the attendant I'd forgotten something urgent at home, and left the Fairmont without saying a single word to my wife. I drove home through the rain that had finally started, alone, and I sat in my study until nearly 2 in the morning, finalizing the last details with Harold and my legal team, because once you've decided to pull a thread like that, you don't sleep until it's fully unspooled. Claudine came home around 1, called an Uber apparently, once she realized I'd actually left. She found me still awake in the study. "What happened to you?" she said, and there was an edge of real irritation in her voice. Not concern. Irritation. The tone of a woman whose evening had been mildly inconvenienced. "You just disappeared. Preston thought it was so weird." "I saw my place card," I said. I kept my voice completely level. "Idiot trash." She actually laughed, a short, surprised huff of a laugh, before she caught herself. "Oh, come on, Sterling, that was clearly some seating mix-up. Bailey probably grabbed the wrong template. It's not that deep." "You and Preston seemed to think it was pretty funny," I said. There was a pause, just half a second too long. "It was just a weird moment. People were laughing at the absurdity of it, not at you specifically." She crossed her arms. "You're being sensitive." I looked at her for a long moment, This woman I had built a decade of my life around, standing in the doorway of my study in her emerald dress, with her makeup slightly smudged from a night I hadn't been present for the second half of, telling me I was being sensitive about a card that had, in calligraphy, called me idiot trash in front of 600 people. "I'm going to bed," I said. And I did. And I slept better that night than I had in months, because for the first time in a year and a half, I wasn't carrying the weight of not knowing. I knew everything now. I just hadn't told her that yet. The email went out Monday at 9:04 a.m. I know the exact time because Harold texted me a screenshot the second he hit send, a habit we'd fallen into over the years whenever something significant crossed his desk. Bellwether Meridian Group, ownership transition announcement. 6 paragraphs, corporate, bloodless, entirely accurate. The company had been acquired by Ashford Bell Partners, effective immediately. As part of the integration, several departments would be restructured over the following 90 days, beginning with client engagement, effective that Friday. All employees in affected roles would receive transition packages and were asked to meet with HR that afternoon for details. I was at home when Claudine's phone started buzzing at 9:06. I watched her face from across the kitchen island as she read it. Watched the color actually drain out of it the way it does in old paintings when someone's about to faint. "Oh my God," she said. "Oh my God, they sold the company. Sterling. They sold the whole company. Nobody knew. This came out of nowhere. This is insane. I have to call Preston." She called Preston 7 times over the next hour. He didn't pick up once. I found out later, through channels that no longer felt like any secret I needed to keep, that Preston Kilgore had spent that entire morning in a closed-door meeting with an Ashford Bell integration lawyer and 2 HR representatives, receiving the news that his position, along with 11 others on his team, had been eliminated effective end of week, and that given the documented misuse of corporate funds discovered during due diligence, misuse I had personally flagged in the data room 3 weeks earlier, his severance package would be considerably smaller than his contract otherwise guaranteed, and that Ashford Bell's legal team would be reviewing whether to refer the expense fraud to outside counsel. Claudine did not lose her job that Friday. Her role, coordinator level, working under Preston, but not implicated in any of the fraud, technically survived the first restructuring wave, though under a new manager flown in from Chicago, who had zero patience for the kind of long lunches and Thursday strategy sessions the department had apparently grown accustomed to. I want to be honest that I never once used my position to have her specifically terminated. I didn't need to. I had built the whole structure so precisely that I never had to touch her career at all. I only had to remove the man she'd built her second life around, and the very culture that let him operate the way he had for years. That night, Monday, she came home from what remained of her office looking hollowed out in a way I'd genuinely never seen on her before, not even during her father's surgery 3 years earlier. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat with a forkful of salmon 18 months earlier, listening to her disdain for a ghost investor. She had no idea was sitting across from her, and she said, "I don't understand what happened. Nobody saw this coming. Preston said the company was solid. He said, Preston doesn't know anything about who actually owns that company," I said. "He never did." Something in my voice must have carried more weight than the sentence itself, because she stopped, really looked at me, the way you look at someone when a shape you've never quite been able to see suddenly resolves itself in the dark. "What do you mean?" she said slowly. "What do you mean, Sterling?" I told her everything then, not cruelly, not as a performance, just flatly, the way I'd give a board a difficult quarterly report. I told her about Vance Meridian Capital, about the 61% stake I'd held in her company since 3 years before she ever worked there, about the April budget I'd killed, that she'd come home and mocked at this exact table. I told her about the Fairmont charge, the canless dinners, the 18 months of expense reports that didn't reconcile. I told her about the 2 sentences I'd said to a man named Desmond Ruiz at a gala she'd humiliated me at, and I told her, last, calmly, that the acquisition had been in motion for over a year on its own financial merits, and that all her affair had done was help me stop hesitating about the timing. She didn't scream. I think some part of her, hearing it all laid out in order, understood immediately that screaming wouldn't move a single piece of what had already happened. She just sat there, very still, and after a long time she said, "You let me humiliate you. At the gala. You just sat there and let me." "I've been letting you underestimate me for 6 years," I said. The card just made it easier to stop. "We are not divorced yet, but the papers are in progress, and I've stopped expecting that to feel like a tragedy." Claudine moved out in November into a rental in Ballard, still working what's left of her job under the new Ashford Bell management. Chastened in a way that would almost be sad to watch if I let myself feel sorry for her, which, most days, I don't quite manage and don't particularly try to. Preston Kilgore, last I heard through Harold, is fighting the fraud referral with a lawyer he can no longer easily afford, and has not, as far as anyone knows, found new work in this city, because it turns out the events industry in Seattle is smaller and gossips more than he ever accounted for. I still eat lunch at the same deli on 24th Avenue. Donna still knows my order. I still drive the same Honda Accord because it runs fine, and I've never seen the point of a car that announces things about a man that aren't true anyway. I sold my remaining stake in Bellwether Meridian to Ashford Bell, as part of the same closing cleanly, completely, because once you've cut a rotten thing out, there's no reason to keep standing near the wound admiring it. I kept the other 5 companies. I'm building a 6th. People who don't understand men like me assume that staying quiet for years means you're weak, or slow, or that you simply haven't noticed the disrespect piling up around you. It's the opposite. Quiet is a decision. Quiet is what lets you see the whole board instead of just the piece someone's trying to distract you with. My wife spent 6 years laughing at a ghost investor she thought was too dull and too irrelevant to ever matter, right up until the morning that ghost investor's signature ended her boyfriend's career and dismantled the entire department in a single email. She called me idiot trash on a printed card in front of 600 people, and I answered her with 2 sentences and a Monday morning nobody in that ballroom ever saw coming. Some men need to raise their voice to be taken seriously. I've found, over a long career and an even longer marriage, that the men who actually run things rarely need to raise anything at all. You know what gets me about this one? It's not the money, it's not the twist. It's how long Sterling stayed quiet. We always think staying silent means you're weak, that you're just letting people walk over you. But sometimes quiet is just someone watching, keeping score, waiting for the right moment. If you've ever been underestimated by people who thought you didn't matter, just remember, you don't owe anyone a warning. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever had a quiet moment like that in your own life? Drop it below. And if you're new here, subscribe. There's a lot more of these coming.